Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. A couple of weeks ago, I did a presentation here in San Francisco at Other Cinema, which is a series of wild and wacky films curated by Craig Baldwin, a wonderful underground filmmaker who specializes in assemblage films, building up films from other films in a cut and paste kind of manner. He has an enormous collection of oddball cinema, and he brings some of that spirit into the series. I've done a lot of talks over there over the years, even though I'm not a filmmaker, but I've enjoyed giving talks where I show clips from lots of different sources and kind of weave it together. And this one was on Jack Parsons, the now much better known rocket scientist come Thelemic magician, whose exploits are now featured in the CBS series Strange Angel, which itself is based on one of the good biographies on Parsons that came out about 10 years ago, a little bit less. And it was a great opportunity for me. I've been fascinated with Jack Parsons since I first heard about him in the early 1990s. One of the things I was talking about in my presentation was just sort of how he kind of entered into popular consciousness, and for so long he was very, very underground. For a while, it was pretty much only remembered by folks in the OTO and very deep esoteric as Los Angelinos. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, a book of his writings came out. His story became mentioned or became part of the lore around L. Ron Hubbard, who was Jack's magical partner in the 1940s before Dianetics and Scientology was born. And indeed, there's some interesting conversations to have about the influence that Thelema and magic had on Parsons' kind of cybernetic Gnostic religion. That was another source. And then another one was in Mike Davis's book, City of Quartz. And Mike Davis is a leftist critic of all manner of things, including architecture and cities. And City of Quartz is about the history of Los Angeles and Southland in general. And, you know, pretty bitter tale. He's not particularly interested in curious religion or mysticism or speculative fantasy. But for him, Parsons did represent a sort of oddness or weirdness inside of the politics and technological politics of Southern California, because Parsons was one of the figures who founded the Jet Propulsion Labs, JPL. And so he represents a certain time when American industry was kind of figuring out how to make really robust connections with educational institutions, in this case, Caltech, which while Parsons didn't go to Caltech, he did his research under its auspices with another Caltech student named Frank Molina. So he represents an interesting period in the kind of history of Southern California development of what we would now call the military-industrial complex, and the fact that there's a wild, sexually liberated, fantastical, a little bit over-the-top magician at the heart of that story is kind of about as allegorical a tale as you need to tap into the weirdness of California, and particularly Southern California. So anyway, I was very interested to talk about the TV show Strange Angel, and to talk about some other films, including Craig Baldwin's own film, which I just want to throw out there, called Mock-Up on Moo. It's, again, one of these assemblage films made up of clips of a lot of other recognizable and largely unrecognized films, but it's woven in with the whole story of Parsons and Cameron and L. Ron Hubbard in kind of a fantastical way that uses the story as a way to critique power, politics, and other features of the kind of California mindscape. So it's very worth checking out if you're interested in experimental film. But one of the things that really interested me about Parsons, and I've written a couple of articles about him for different publications, studied him for a while, but in watching the new show, or relatively new show in particular, is just that this is the most closely focused representation of Thelema, of Aleister Crowley's religion and the ritual practices of the OTO that we've really had in anything like the mainstream. And, again, one of the major themes of this podcast for the last 8 years has been my sort of alternately gleeful and woozy shock at how quickly and deeply formerly underground or esoteric topics have become part in some way of the mainstream. I'm not really sure if the mainstream exists anymore, but it's on CBS. It's on, Strange Angel is on the sides of buses. And for those of us who have been interested in this stuff from a more esoteric perspective, this whole transition is, again, very strange. It's kind of marvelous, and it's also often produces a kind of wooziness as the story gets distorted, as it inevitably does. So I thought nothing would be more fun to do than to talk to someone who's in the OTO, who is a scholar of Thelema, a scholar of Crowley, who knows the tale inside and out. And to, talk about the representations of Thelema and Parsons' life, and to kind of meditate on why Parsons is such an interesting figure from not just a magical, but just a general cultural perspective. And I couldn't think of anyone better than Richard Kaczynski, who wrote a great biography of Aleister Crowley, Perdurabo, the life of Aleister Crowley, and written a number of things about Thelema. And I saw him do some talks and presentations at the Esoteric Book Conference in Seattle a number of years ago, and really enjoyed his energy. His combination of humor and scholarship was one that I could quite take to. So I thought it would be pretty fun to talk to Richard. So Richard, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
So let's just start off a little bit with the TV show. I think when we talked about this before, I said we have to make an agreement that we can carp about the all the things they get wrong, like up to a certain point, and then we got to move on because, both of us, I'm sure, have all sorts of quibbles and issues. But before we even get into that, just talk a little bit about, you've been interested in Thelema for decades, and, been in the order for decades. It's a major part of your life. What was it kind of like for you and folks you knew to just even know that this TV show was coming out, that there was going to be, it must have been a sort of strange, kind of a slightly surreal process to see, like, the mainstream Hollywood world really get down and try to represent the OTO.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it would be fair to say that even before any footage or anything was released, that people, but I know at least, the reaction was very guarded. And the reason for that is there have been a number of documentaries done on Aleister Crowley over the years, and they're almost universally, with the exception of one, just horrible. So there just seems to be this inability for people to get this right. And so hearing that there's going to be a TV series about Jack Parsons, it's like, oh, cool, but oh my God, are we going to ruin this? But then, when we hear that, the title Strange Angel is taken from George Pendle's book, which was, a very good biography of Parsons. And you see Ridley Scott's name attached to this as executive producer, and it's going to be on CBS. And all of a sudden this is like, wow, this is like big leagues, and so the idea that Jack Parsons is, as you mentioned just a few minutes ago, becoming more mainstream was exciting to see also. And, of course, there's always that question in the back of my mind is that, well, if Jack Parsons is getting really popular, can Crowley be far behind, before he gets some sort of mini series or some other sort of treatment that actually does him justice?
Yeah,
So yeah.
that would be a remarkable thing to see. I mean, and there again we can, as we can sit here and quibble about it. I would love to say that it was a great show. It's not a great show. Just as a drama, there's really slow parts, and they kind of go down really dumb, fabricated tales. I mean, the story, the true story, or the true-ish story that we get from the biographies is so wonderful in itself that you really don't need to add anything at all. And they added some stuff and kind of went down some cul-de-sacs that were silly. There were some, but at the same time, I have to give them some, kind of grudging admiration for the way that they did set up a number of really juicy and important details in his life and elements of his psychology that I think they actually got pretty well. I want to talk about the science stuff later, because I know that you've also written on the connection between magic and science. Of course, the idea of the method of science as being one of the routes towards what Crowley called scientific illuminism. So I want to get to that. But let's start with just the way that the show represents OTO rituals, Thelema, the kind of ambiance of being part of an order like that. What were your reactions and the reactions of folks that you know? I mean, what seemed important? What seemed the most lamentable? What seemed actually surprisingly good to you?
Oh, where to begin? I guess to start with, I don't think at any point in the show do they actually refer to the organization as Ordo Templi Orientis.
I believe you're right.
So what they're fictionalizing is something else. And it's interesting to hear some lines and some passages being recited on a mainstream TV show that you recognize, but they're done in this very different context. And this idea that in Strange Angel, this order he belongs to kind of has people who get picked to go out and try to groom and recruit members in the way they depict. There's just, really kind of the antithesis of what Crowley's Thelema is all about, which is, do what thou wilt, and that meaning be true to your nature and exists in the way that is right for you, and to try to influence other people's course in their lives, through manipulation and coercion and some of the sorts of ickier stuff they depict in the show is just not how it works.
Yeah, in that sense, I think it was partly meditating or fictionalizing just the kind of larger issue of especially in Southern California, of small sectarian movements, what some people call cults or whatever. And so they it's almost like you can't, once you start telling the story of like some small, unusual religious group that has kind of heterodox practices, it's almost inevitable that you start calling up these kind of archetypes of cult behavior, one of which is that kind of, manipulation of people, which like, as you point out, does sort of seems off to the side. But at the same time, you get sort of an idea of the will. You get a sense of the role that eros and sexuality can play in that, and the way in which people come together around a focused sort of on ritual that incarnates or manifests these principles. So I kind of ended up looking at it as actually a sort of interesting meditation on what it means to kind of pursue spiritual growth or one's own psycho-spiritual development through the context of one of these strange kinds of groups. So whether or not they got the details right or wrong, I also thought it was actually kind of an interesting way of showing how, for example, different people have very different motivations to being there, but in some sense, to be part of a group like that is to share other people's, interpretations of what it is. And of course, there's always going to be multiple interpretations.
Yeah, absolutely. And and again, if you kind of squint at this, look a little sideways at it, you see the resemblances, and then, as you say, the details may be off, but the general theme is there. And I can acknowledge that some of the fictionalization that happened is there to give each of the characters their own arcs that they go through, and even though those arcs, say for the character Susan, may not necessarily represent what actually happened to the real life person that she represents. For dramatic and storytelling purposes, it makes for a satisfying story, and so there's that balance between accuracy and faithfulness and making good television, I suppose.
What did they get right? What do you think? What were you pleased to see, even if it was not entirely correct? Like, leaving aside the correctness of it and acknowledging that obviously we're going to be in this realm of fictionalization, and the same thing happens with the scientific story. They get the bare bones right, but there's lots of things that are made up. But nonetheless, it's still a representation that goes out. It has a role in people's lives that it didn't before. So, what were you happy to see in that representation?
I think the thing that I was most satisfied with is the arc for the character Susan, who biographer represents Helen, his Jack Parsons' first wife. But when you first meet her and she is very devout and religious, they're kind of setting up this conflict between her faith and what Jack, winds up getting involved in. And while that, the previews, kind of set off warning bells with things like, have you ever seen True Evil and things like that? Like, oh my God, how are we going to paint, this, Thelema in this? That by the end of the season that she starts coming around. And so that journey from her devout family upbringing to finding some value in this philosophy that at first seemed very repugnant to her, I thought was a good thing to see, that there is, that she did find something of value in it after all.
Yeah, and of course, one of the way that the show tells the story, that a lot of her transformation comes about through a personal relationship, or kind of a close relationship with the leader of the group, who they call Alfred, based on Wilfred Smith, portrayed by Greg Wise. And it's a pretty good, I like his performance as a certain kind of, not just magus, but a sort of a group leader who has a kind of charisma and a kind of confidence. And even though there's some odd kind of fun elements where he takes photographs of people to like determine how like realized their personality is, which is just, I mean, it's kind of fun. It's just goofy. But at the same time, some of the conversations were really interesting, and I thought he was a pretty good, had a pretty good performance. But I am kind of curious, how do you have a sense of Wilfred Smith and what kind of personality he had, what kind of vibe he had? That's one thing that I've never really gotten from the material that I've read. Parsons, you get a sense of his kind of conflicted but rich and sometimes adolescent and sometimes brilliant kind of personality from reading through the histories. Wilfred Smith has always been a little bit more unclear to me. Do you see him as a kind of powerful spiritual leader? What kind of character was he?
I've not met him, so it's hard to say. But it's kind of funny, because I remember when I was first working in Perturabo, I spent a month at the Warburg Institute at the University of London, where the largest collection of Crowley's papers are kept, and there's all these letters from W.T. Smith there. And it's kind of funny, because you read through these letters of Smith's and Parsons and Regina Call and all these other folks who were, Helen and all these other folks who were part of the California group, and what they wrote to Crowley and him back. and to later and got like pull out these photo albums of those people, and it's almost like you can look and say that's him. You know, you don't even need to be told that's Wilfrid. You just kind of know. And so my impression, which is all I can really tell you, is that Smith seems to me to have been a quietly hardworking and devoted person. And I think quiet perhaps is the thing that comes across to me, that he wasn't this outgoing, charismatic sort of figure like Jack was. And I think perhaps that's why Crowley came to favor Jack over Wilfrid as a leader for the Agape Lodge in California. But he was nevertheless hardworking. I mean, Smith had moved to Detroit in the 1910s to be with Crowley and to work with him on publishing at that time. You used his attic space as a temple for OTO in California, and when Crowley would lay into him mercilessly, he just kind of took it off to a great deal until there's points where he finally just snaps back. But that's not really his way. Oftentimes, other people would write these nasty grams back to Crowley on his behalf. But even when they came to a breaking of parting of the ways, it was just with a lot of sadness. It wasn't with a lot of there was certainly some bitterness, but it wasn't a lot of passion or anger in Wilfrid that came through in his letters. It was just the disappointment of someone who basically devoted his life to this movement and feeling kind of mistreated and not appreciated from someone who was managing from a distance, across the ocean, and not really seeing what he was, sacrificing for it.
I've always been interested also, and I'm curious to hear what you think, since you've traced Thelema in America. You wrote a book about that Detroit scene and all the stuff that went down there. But it always kind of interested me that when Crowley died, that the place where Thelema was most alive was in California. And I'm a historian of California. I'm kind of fascinated with what is sort of unique or singular about California. And to me, even though there are prosaic reasons that the Agape Lodge wound up there, in terms of people moving around, there also seems to be some kind of symbolic weight there, that there's no accident that this is where we see these rich characters, including some of the people, the actors, John Carradine, people who would show up at the lodge, or Harry Hay playing organ, goes on to found the Mattachine Society. And so there's this sense of a crossroads of culture, not just esoteric seeking, of which there was a lot in California, but also experiments with sexual relations, with polyamory, with drugs. That there was a way in which it was just such a fertile environment for that. So I'm just kind of curious if you look at the way in which Thelema developed, both in terms of the 30s and 40s, towards the end of Crowley's life, but even afterwards, going on to, there's the Caltech Grady McMurtry connection. I mean, there's all this interesting stuff that kind of points to this web work of California. And I'm curious how you think about that in terms of the history of Thelema.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I think that you do have this nexus of people who were very creative in different ways, and whether that be, as you alluded to earlier, the beginnings of an alliance between academia and government in terms of developing technology, whether it be the science fiction community and the dreamers that are part of that, and then again the experiments with sexuality and drugs and spirituality. I mean, it seems like a very natural melting pot where there would be a critical mass of people that were interested in something like OTO. So it's not surprising to me that that was the place where it started. I mean, there certainly could have been other spots around the world one could have pointed to, but
one other question. This is again just a matter of, it would be your impression rather than necessarily something that you knew definitively. But having read through this material, and I've read some other, correspondences and stuff by Jane Wolfe and whatever, to try to get a little bit better sense of what it kind of felt like, what the vibe was like, what the social feeling was like at the Agape in the 40s. And sometimes I go, maybe like what would it be like if I was transported there? How would it seem? Would it seem radical? Would it seem, super edgy? Or would it actually seem like it had those elements, but in other ways it was more, I don't know what to say, that it was the kind of place that ladies who were seekers and who might have gotten into theosophy, or might go hang out with the Self-Realization Fellowship, but then they hear about the Agape Lodge and they go there and they do whether it might actually be less edgy than we kind of want to believe, and certainly that the TV show wants us to believe, because
Right.
for us, Crowley, it's very hard to see the history of Thelema on the other side of the counterculture, because where Crowley is such this figure in the counterculture, and there's so much this sense of the way that, sex and drugs and magic and the occult revival are all part of this kind of intense bohemia, that I think there are elements of it that aren't like that back in the day. And I just love to hear you comment on that, on the different kinds of people who might have come there, the ways in which the edginess was also balanced with a more, I don't want to say prosaic, but just a more even-handed approach to metaphysical seeking.
Yeah, well, I think that the expectation or the imagination of what a secret society is going to be like is never going to be the same as the reality. And it may be perhaps that imagination may be overly romanticized or overly dramatized, which isn't to say that these sorts of groups aren't also edgy and cool in their own way, but it's what you can imagine is limitless. So on the one hand, yeah, I mean, I get that, particularly when Agape Lodge was functioning out of the parsonage, Parsons' home there, and he was advertising, for bohemian people to come and live there as renters, and that normal people would be turned away. Yeah, you very much get the idea that things must have been way out there, there's that story. Obviously, nothing came of it, but the police came because they heard there was a naked woman jumping through a hoop of fire or something. The neighbors were concerned. But on the other hand, if you read an account of the history of that period, and Martin Starr has a book called The Unknown God, which is kind of a biography of W.T. Smith, but also kind of a just biography of that whole California movement. You get the sense that there's, they're doing initiation ceremonies, and these ceremonies require, paraphernalia. They do require memorization. There's paperwork that goes with this. The fact that, Martin Starr can give the dates that these things happen shows that paperwork was being done. And so there's a discipline side to this as well, that people are reading and studying and doing that stuff. But yeah, I really do get the sense that there was a lot of stuff going on and drama going on. And I think that was part of the frustration that Crowley had with this. Because again, he is living in London or the UK, Hastings, wherever he was at the time, somewhere in the UK. And he's getting these letters from Southern California, and his impression, and he says this in one of his letters, is he's tired because he keeps getting these letters about A is in love with B, who's chasing after C, who wants to be with D, and so on, several times through the alphabet. So he just gets the impression that there's these, endless interpersonal intrigues going on that are just ripping the community apart. And I think that's part of what was driving Crowley trying to kind of manage this from a distance, and trying to take Smith out of the equation and put Parsons in his place, and why, Grady McMurtry kind of gets sent out there with these, emergency powers, that if things were to get out of hand, he can kind of step in.
Mm-hmm. So, you mentioned at the beginning there about how the reality of societies, of secret societies or esoteric groups is, different than the imagination. And in fact, one of my favorite sequences in the show, which it's a difficult one to recommend because there's some bad parts and there's some mistakes and blind cul-de-sacs, but there's some really good parts as well. And one of the ones I really liked is when they go to a ritual at this lodge, and Jack's kind of in a bad mood. He's like, he can't decide whether to take his mundane job's offer of a promotion to manager, and he's sort of grumpy. And you see him, like, he notices like the ceiling's leaking, and then he runs into one of his frauders, and the frauder's like, baking the cakes to use in the ritual, and he's like late, and you get a really, as someone who's participated in esoteric groups, and I'm sure you can agree, there's the way in which the kind of mundane enters in, and it can be deflationary in some ways, but it also is really kind of humanizing, and actually in a way it makes it even more kind of real. But it's this really interesting balance, because so many people initially maybe are attracted to these things just for the fantasy, for the imagination, for what it can, and of course that's part of why we're there, is like, what is the imagination? What is fantasy? How do we manifest it? How do we intensify it? But at the same time, it requires changing the light bulb, and the carpet's stained, and you got to fix it has this kind of mundane quality that's sort of charming in a way. And I thought they did a nice job actually of kind of balancing that, so it wasn't all the kind of drama.
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny because one of my reactions to seeing this dramatization of this ritual is that there's the one point where, the one ritualist pulls out a sword and cuts, just literally tears in half this veil, and I could think, that would never happen. You know how much it would cost to replace that veil every week? So
That's it. I love that.
Rooting on this fantastic drama.
Absolutely. Well, I'm curious, I know there's not an official, OTO stance on Parsons, but I've read, very mixed approaches. Some people in the end go, and, these are things that happen in his life much later than the series shows, but if you take the whole arc of his life when he leaves the lodge and goes out on his own or whatever, and some people are like, actually in the end of the day, he was kind of a blowhard, kind of a lousy magician, he didn't really follow the rule, whatever, and yet he's also this very charismatic figure who is now, a pop culture figure to some degree. So I can only imagine that there's some ambivalence around how Jack Parsons functions as a kind of avatar representation of Thelema in the popular imagination, regardless of this particular show, but just as sort of a figure that people think about, a figure that people know. So how does he kind of function, at least as you see it, within the kind of, panoply of Thelema and of the OTO?
Yeah. Well, again, as you point out, opinions range widely, from him being kind of, as you say, kind of someone who messed up constantly, to those who, consider him some sort of a saint. I guess my take on this is that, part of the idea of Thelema is that this is the idea of discovering and doing your will, is representative of this new eon, which is the eon of the child. And children are undisciplined, they're impetuous, they're impulsive. And in that sense, Jack Parsons seems to embody those characteristics in both his science and his magic. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think it's this when he brings that to his science, to the rocketry, he doesn't play by the rules because he's self-taught and he doesn't know the rules. But at the same time, that means he doesn't know to think this is not possible. He can dream and he can imagine things, and then go to his other colleagues and say, how can we make this happen? It's much in the same sense that it's, people who grew up watching Star Trek, see communicators and things like this, and they say, I want that in the world. It's dreamers who make things, who come up with ideas, and scientists who then make them happen. And Jack was kind of like straddling, both of those things. He had the ideas that he wanted to see happen, and he had just enough of the science to kind of get there. And with his magical work, there's the Babylon working, which seemed to have a result. If you believe the story about Parsons in the boat, which we can get into if there's time, that had a result. But the thing is, Parsons as a magician or as a writer didn't really have that much influence in his lifetime. But I really think what's important about him is not necessarily what he brought to Thelema, but who he brought to Thelema. Because it was Helen that he introduced, and Helen would then go on to marry Wilfred Smith, and she would be instrumental in reviving OTO, and she ran Thelema Publications in the 70s and 80s, sold Crowley editions as a bookseller and as an antiquarian bookseller as well. So she was a really important figure. He introduced Grady McMurtry to the OTO, and there's a Grady who again had these emergency powers to restart OTO if he needed to take control, and that's those emergency powers that he used in the 70s to restart OTO. Marjorie Cameron. I have a colleague by the name of Chris Judica who gave a presentation in Barcelona this summer about how between her artwork and her collaboration with Kenneth Grant and inaugurations of Pleasure Dome kind of became the archetype of Babylon to a whole generation of magicians. So these people that Jack brought were immensely important, and I think it's fair to say that if there was no Jack Parsons, there would be no OTO today, because it's those people he brought to ensure that it stayed alive.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I hadn't thought about that. It makes a lot of sense. Although I also agree with you that Cameron, I mean, she's being more recognized now, but in terms of an inspiration and a link between that period and the later, Bohemian counterculture, she's so important, and she influenced not only magicians but artists as well. So some of the really vital art that came out of that era, Wallace Berman and on, those guys were influenced by her as well, and thankfully she's now coming to be appreciated as the remarkable artist that she was as well. So it really becomes a very rich story. So you'd been talking, you mentioned, and I agree with you very much, that there's a really interesting relationship between Parsons' magic and Parsons' science, in the sense that he brought a similar kind of sense of impetuous imagination, of a refusal to be limited. And this was seen in the rocketry, not only in that he was self-taught and he was more interested in experiment than in theory, but also just even and in the 1930s, even to imagine that rocketry was possible. As the show correctly actually, the show does a better job with the science than it does with Thelema, although I still think it does an okay job with both. And they bring that forward, that it was just that a lot of real scientists in the 1930s thought that rocketry was ridiculous. So just even to be able to think that was possible, to take those fantasies that were as much a part of science fiction as they were a part of technological possibility, and then to run with it was really remarkable. And so, but I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that connection between science and magic, because of course it goes a little deeper than just his spirit of impetuousness, because one of the things that Crowley talks about is that as the method of science, that that along with the religious aim, there's a kind of scientific methodology or a kind of empiricism, a kind of theory and experiment that is intrinsic to at least modern, the kind of modern occult current that Crowley, gets in motion in many ways. And that's definitely in Parsons' own mind. And it's interesting to go through his writings and to find places where he both sees a connection between magic and science and then kind of insists on a division between them. And he kind of does both. But it raises this deeper question about the role of science in the modern occult, and in particular in Thelema. So I know you've written a bit about this. You've written about a piece on the method of science, and you have done social science. You've done work with medicine. You're aware of scientific practice. You participated in those kinds of knowledge practices as well. How do you characterize that connection between magic and science, at least in a Thelemic context?
Well, as you point out, Crowley had this motto, the method of science, seeing with religion, as characterizing his approach to things. Scientific illuminism, was another phrase that he used. And his definition of magic, is that it's the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. And that definition itself, while it's very broad, in his book Magic Theory and Practice, Crowley even says that the act of blowing one's nose is an act of magic because you are doing something in conformity with your will. And using that broad definition, doing science is also magic. Doing anything is magic. There's a great quote from Alan Moore talking about how writing, art is magic, because a writer writes words on paper and people read these things and they experience, a change in their consciousness, and they have visions and things like that as a result of the written word. And while he's talking about people reading fiction, visualizing it, the idea that the process of creating that is an act of magic also is interesting. But none of that really gets into the science piece of it. But yeah, Crowley throws out certain bits that, the idea that one needs to keep a diary, a journal, a record of one's experiments in magic, so that one can go back and kind of evaluate, the conditions in which things worked or did not work. And he encourages this pragmatic approach that, what works for him may not work for you. So the key is keep this record, do experiments, and find out what works for you. And then once you figure those things out, keep doing that. There's a whole lot of other considerations, with the scientific method that, Crowley doesn't get into, but that one could also extrapolate on, and that's kind of been, like what I do in my talks and the article that you reference, because there's, things like, threats to internal validity and generalization and these other concepts that one can bring to evaluating one's work that, while Crowley certainly doesn't speak about, are things that are part of the scientific method that one can adapt.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm thinking about one of the connections that I found between the science and magic and Parsons, which is that, with the rocketry, part of what was made it obsessive for him was just the fun of blowing things up. And it was and they do a decent job of representing this in the show, where there's conflict where, to really make the technology work, they're going to have to just actually stop shooting things into the sky, but create a jet that's just stationary, and then they have to measure it, and so it's not as fun. And so Parsons is complaining, and sometimes he'll just go and shoot off a rocket just for the heck of it because he wants that explosion. He wants that imaginative excitement, even when it's really it's not really appropriate for the pure science that they're working on, which requires more theory, more equations, et cetera, et cetera. And then reading and I think it was Jane Wolfe, I can't remember who was commenting in a letter about Parsons at the time, was saying that, like, one of the things that characterized his magic, which we would say is more left hand than other people in the lodge. They was like, oh, he's into voodoo and the hungan and, witchcraft and all that stuff, which is kind of funny for us because we kind of think about left hand being more as part of that current. But for Parsons, that was really key. But her line that's really funny is that she says, I think he's into it for the effects. Like, he wanted weird stuff to happen. He wanted the poltergeist. He wanted, the visceral sense that something had happened in a very similar way, because it wasn't necessarily the goal. Like, the goal might be more spiritual or metaphysical or, internal, but along the way, there's these effects that he was really interested in.
Yeah, I guess there's this idea that kind of like playing the piano or something like that. You don't just sit down and play the first time. And so the kind of idea with ritual magic is that there's ceremonies you practice and rehearse and get better at before you may experience the bang, as it were. And so I think part of my sense of that letter, and I do believe you're right, it was Jane Wolfe wrote that letter, is that there's an impatience there that he's trying this thing, trying that thing, and that's not giving me the bang, let me try something else. And he's just kind of casting about, trying anything, just searching for something that will give him the experience that he's looking at, because the more disciplined approach of be patient with this is just was not his preferred way of doing things.
Yeah, clearly not his personality. Hey, I just realized I've always had a question, and I may be wrong, so forgive me if I misunderstood. My impression is that there are a few Parsons texts that have never been published that are pretty easily available on the internet. The Book of Babylon. There's some correspondence between him and Cameron, and of course there's all sorts of correspondence that isn't available out there. And as far as I understand it, that the bulk of that material, if not all of it, is that the OTO controls the rights to. And so why isn't there like a really excellent, footnoted, super tight book that collects these unpublished writings and puts it in context? I mean, Hieronymus Beta is a great editor and a great scholar, as well as, a very important figure. And I'm kind of curious, is there some reason that that's not there? Or maybe I don't have the story right, because it just seems like, especially now, what a great way to really kind of go, okay, if Parsons a figure, let's really look at what he's writing. Let's analyze it. Let's show where the faults of it, how it fits into esoteric history. And I just want that book. So I'm curious whether anything like that's in the works.
I don't know for a fact whether or not OTO owns the copyright to the writings of Jack Parsons. I don't know. But I do know that there have actually been two collections of his essays published. There was, in the 80s, I believe, a paperback that came out from New Falcon, if I remember correctly, but it was called Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword. And it was part of OTO's Oriflamme series of books. The other volume in that series was something called The Revival of Magic, which was a collection of Crowley's essays. But the first volume in that series was Jack Parsons' essays. And then I believe...
Yeah, there's another one too. I can't remember the other one.
There's one that there was like a black hardcover with a photo of Jack on the cover in his trench coat, put out by Titan Press. And that may also be called Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword. I'm not sure if I'm remembering the title of that one correctly, but that was, again, another collection of his essays. So those books are out there. In terms of why isn't there another one out there? I suppose part of this is that while Hymenaeus Beta is, as you say, a great scholar and editor, he can only do so many books at a time. And unless someone has come forth with a proposal to do something like this, that may be why. Part of it may also just be due to the fact that, for publishing, there is an economic consideration. It's like how many, publishers can wonder how many copies of a book can I sell? And if there's already 2 other collections of Parsons' essays out there and the stuff's on the internet for free, a publisher may not be as eager to put that stuff out. So, I mean,
there's always those things. Well, I hope that there's enough, because some of those pieces are really, really interesting. The name of the other book, by the way, I just was checking online, is 3 Essays on Freedom, which is why you were thinking it was kind of the same name, because
right.
And it has that great, his great libertarian screed in there. Really one of my favorite American pieces of American anarchism. It's just really wonderful. And he was a little bit of a prophet in his own right too. And I believe in that particular essay, Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword. Both in terms of having a very critical attitude towards science and technology as it was developing in the post-war era, but also, and this is what I'd like to turn to in the few minutes we have left, also in terms of really emphasizing the power of women's sexuality, but also of the empowered woman as a spiritual leader and force. And while it's bound up in complicated ways with his own erotic sensibility, and there's some elements of what I could only call kind of cheesiness in it, at the same time it's pretty prophetic in the sense of looking, if you look at it from the perspective of the, say, 1970s and the explosion of not just sort of goddess feminism, but like really serious female driven witchcraft practices and a powerful invocation of sexuality as a transformative force. And so that which kind of brings me around to my question, which is how you think, either in terms of how the show represents it and misses the point, but what was important about the role that sexuality, and particularly the empowerment of women's sexuality, played in that formative period in the late 30s and 40s in the Agape Lodge?
Well, I think just speaking to the idea of sexual empowerment and that being something particularly important for the women members of the lodge, because that's historically it's the women have been the subject of so much sexual repression and double standards and the sorts of abuses that we hear about in the Me Too movement and so on, that this is a very powerful thing to say, here, have this, and you have power, you have authority, you have autonomy, you have control over your body and your reproductive choices, and all of this is great. And as much as we may talk about someone like Grady McMurtry or Jack Parsons coming out of the Agape Lodge, we do have figures like Marjorie Cameron, Helen Parsons, Phyllis Seckler. I even think very fondly, I believe that there's a letter from Regina Call, who was one of the other Agape Lodge members, just again, just kind of writing to Crowley, really angry about the way he's mistreating, Wilfred Smith, and saying, your letter is just a lot of what we'd call blah, baloney, and bullshit. And Crowley writes back saying, your letter is full of obscenities. I cannot respond to this. But he's just out there. He's just giving him what for. I just love it. It's just go out there, kick ass. It's great.
Well, I mean, do you feel that Thelema played a role then in sort of creating a space for a more, a kind of release of women's empowerment as a spiritual possibility, as a spiritual source? Or is that kind of an overreading? Like that's what I'm trying to figure out, is like, how do they set it up? How is it, how does it go forward?
Well, I think the idea of possibility is the key term there, because I think while that's certainly the ideal, the every man, every woman is a star, the law is for all, and those sorts of ideas are at the core of Thelemic belief. When you look at the way things played out in the sorts of interpersonal politics and interpersonal drama that came out of the various romantic intrigues and betrayals and hurt feelings and rebounds and all that kind of stuff, is that these things, while they are great ideals in practice, they're still things that the human beings involved are still trying, they have their own baggage to work through, and then we still have a lot of norms and boundaries and expectations that are at odds with those ideas, that are part of mainstream society, and they're part of our psyche as a function of growing up in that society. So, that there's that tension between being able to realize the ideal and the ideal bumping up against this sort of ingrained social programming that we're all trying to get around and get past.
Yeah, very, very well said, and I appreciate your candor on that one. Well, we just have a minute left, so I'm actually just kind of curious if you heard one way or the other that the show was renewed or it was canceled. Would you care?
I'd kind of like to see what happens.
Yeah.
Or what they do. You'd mentioned that it gets kind of the narrative gets kind of dull at points. I didn't experience that, because I guess I'm interested. I want to see what they do with the stories. So even the slow bits were not slow to me. So I'm curious to see where they go with it, how they deal with some of the issues that they haven't touched on yet. Again, things like the Cameron story of L. Ron Hubbard coming in, and all that other all the other things that are part of that.
Yeah, it'll be very curious. Well, I also hope that it passes, because it just gets wilder and weirder. So it should be good. And Richard, thanks so much for speaking with us on Expanding Mind.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, very good. And once again, that was Richard Kaczynski, whose book Perdurabo, The Life of Aleister Crowley, is definitely, I don't know if you can say one of the definitive bios. There's been so many bios of Crowley, but it's certainly extremely thorough, and I really appreciate him being on the show today. And until next week, keep your minds open.